Well, like we just said, Israel's reeling from the latest terror attack in Tel Aviv that saw a Palestinian gunman open fire on a bar, killing 3 people and injuring over a dozen. The terrorist has been identified as Ra'ad Hazem, a 28-year-old resident of Jenin in the northern West Bank. And he's believed to have snuck through gaps in the West Bank security barrier that borders Israeli territory before making his way to Tel Aviv to carry out this attack. Well, Defense Minister Benny Gantz is now announcing plans to invest $111 million to strengthen the barrier. And joining us to break this down is I-24 News host and economic analyst Ariel Margalith and our correspondent Ariel Levin-Waldman. So, Ariel Margalith, I'd first like to turn to you. Tell us about how this money would be invested, exactly in the barrier. What are the problems that exist with it today?
At the moment, we're looking at actually stitching the gaps. It's not a big budget. The budget that's in discussion right now, and it's really an initiative of Benny Gantz that was already in the halls and in discussions last week. So before that terror attack happened in Tel Aviv Thursday night, it was already in discussions. Now it's obviously going to be fertilized, and there is a plan to invest around $111 million, as you mentioned, and that's really to just weave some parts of the fence that have been broken over the last few years. You have to understand that it's a reality that the IDF is very much aware of. It doesn't surprise anyone. There are more than 80,000 Palestinian workers that come to work in Israel every day. Even among them, some of them choose not to go through the official crossings, but actually go through one of those gaps, which makes it easier and faster. Otherwise, they have to wake up perhaps at 4 a.m.
Hours at checkpoints.
Yeah, of course, to stand through the checkpoints. So it's really going to be weaving and closing some of these gaps that are spread all along the fence. We have to mention it's a fence that was built by Benjamin Netanyahu, former prime minister. And has done pretty well in protecting Israel from big terror attacks. But still, there's so many of those holes, and it's a small budget. The bigger plan is going to have to deal with this fence and find new ways in order to protect Israel in a better way.
So that's what I wanted to ask you. The barrier is seen as very controversial by the rest of the world. Why was it built in the first place? And has it truly been effective in preventing terror in Israel?
The sad reality is that it has been effective. Locking around 2 million Palestinians behind a fence has proven to be effective if the effectiveness that you're looking to measure is the fact that Israel did not see as many terror attacks and that it was not as easy for terrorists to access Israel. If you're trying to assess other things, other parameters like human rights, if you're trying to assess what this means for the future of Palestinian generations and Israeli generations, I'm not sure if the answer is the same, but it did do a very good job. Some of these gaps in the fence are very much known to the security community, as I mentioned, and to the IDF. It was very comfortable and convenient in past years to avoid putting too much attention on those, but now they're going to be remediated. In addition to that, Gantz is talking about a bigger plan of around $650 million or so to really rebuild some of these areas in a manner that is more similar to what you see across the center of the country. Jenin is in the northwest bank. In the center of the country, you're seeing a wall that is very hard to pass, a concrete wall. In these areas, you're talking about a fence that is much easier to carve a hole into.
So I want to turn to you, Ariel Levin-Waldman. Another one of the primary issues that Israel is facing is these lone wolf attacks. It's extremely hard for the Israeli government to tackle terror when it's emanating from so many different parts of Israel and the Palestinian territories. And it's also not as organized. There's no organized movement here. Some of these attacks are from Arab Israelis affiliated with the Islamic State. Then we're just seeing attacks from Palestinians located within the West Bank. So, I guess my question is, what money is going towards providing security on the streets of Israel? Is that the answer, or is there a different methodology here?
Real ways you can look at that, because we spent the past few minutes discussing the costs of preventing terrorism, and you've pointed out that it's not cheap on either the human cost or the economic cost. And Israel as a whole spends something in the vicinity of 5% of its total GDP on defense every single year, to the tune of $18 billion or so. It's a truly staggering cost, but it is in many ways the brutal necessities of living in this region. With that in mind, what tends to work work better for preventing what sorts of attacks? Well, certainly we can talk about new technologies and the more expensive events of putting out sensors on borders for trying to find anybody crossing through. But when it comes down to stopping lone wolves or anybody claiming an ideological position, Israel's had its best bet with the human intelligence side of the operation. And one of the challenges with assessing that is we don't really have an itemized budget for how that works. That's all hidden in the sort of deep recesses of Israel's security bureaucracy. All the details are kept away from the public eye because once you have an itemized list, you have a lot of details you can use to find out who's involved in what, and the government takes a lot of precautions to avoid that. What we do know in the past is that avoiding these attacks has been the domain of undercover forces like the Mistar Avim or the Imam unit that goes in, often grooms potential informants within these Arab communities, and over the course of months, if not years, builds up an intelligence relation to head them off. One of the high-ranking people in Shabak came out and said, look, we've had these major attacks over the past week, but over the course of the last year, upwards of 600 serious and credible threats have been thwarted under this method.
Right. This brings me to my last question because we're running out of time here, so quick answer. You know, taxes in Israel are very high. How much of Israeli taxes are actually going to security? You said this makes up 5% of the GDP. And, you know, what about education? Because that would also seem like something that would be extremely important in terms of fighting the ideological issue here, right?
Well, that's a huge challenge because it's not about education. We're not talking about their learning in our schools in Israel. They're learning in many ways in their own schools, in their own homes, in their own mosques. You can invest in some level of ideological indoctrination, but it's not really going to be able to counter a severe cultural difference. And again, you can't really put a dollar value on that. If you're talking about fighting terrorism, it's not via education. It's about human intelligence, and it is about investing in communities, not in the form of education, but in building up enough of an economic base that there's something to lose by committing a terror attack.